The late afternoon sun hung low over the city, painting the glass walls of Street Gabriel Medical Center in shades of gold and amber. The hospital parking lot buzzed with the usual end-of-shift chaos, nurses exchanging tired smiles, paramedics rushing stretchers through the emergency entrance, and exhausted doctors finally heading home after another day of fighting the thin line between life and death. A deep, smooth engine hum broke through the noise. A bright red Ferrari slowly rolled into the parking lot, its polished surface reflecting the fading sunlight like liquid fire. Heads turned instantly. A few medical interns standing near the entrance whispered to each other, their eyes wide. Inside the Ferrari sat Dr. Marcus Bennett, one of the hospital's most respected trauma surgeons. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, steady but tired. The dark circles under his eyes told the real story of the day he'd just survived. 14 hours inside the trauma unit. One emergency surgery after another. A car crash victim. A stabbing. And finally, a 12-year-old boy whose heart had nearly stopped before Marcus and his team managed to pull him back. Marcus exhaled slowly as he guided the Ferrari into an empty parking space near the staff entrance. For a moment, he simply sat there. The quiet inside the car felt strange after the relentless noise of hospital monitors and rushing footsteps. His shoulders relaxed as the adrenaline from the day finally began to fade. He closed his eyes briefly, replaying the moment the young patient had finally started breathing again. Another life saved. That was enough. Marcus opened the car door and stepped out into the warm evening air. The scent of rain lingered in the breeze, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled softly across the sky. He adjusted his dark jacket and glanced toward the hospital entrance, where a few nurses waved at him. "Long day, Dr. Bennett?" one of them called. Marcus smiled faintly. "When is it not?" he replied. A few of the interns couldn't help but stare at the Ferrari. For them, the car looked out of place in a hospital lot, filled mostly with old sedans and SUVs. But Marcus barely noticed their attention. He wasn't thinking about the car at all. He was thinking about going home, about finally getting some sleep, about maybe ordering takeout and turning off his phone for once. He reached into his pocket to grab his keys, and that's when the flashing lights appeared. At first, the glow was faint, just a reflection bouncing off the side of the Ferrari. Then the red and blue lights exploded across the entire parking lot. Marcus slowly turned around. A police cruiser had pulled into the lot behind him, its siren chirping once before falling silent. The flashing lights painted the pavement in harsh colors as the vehicle rolled to a stop directly behind the Ferrari. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. The nurses near the entrance stopped talking. 2 paramedics pushing a stretcher slowed their steps. Even the interns fell silent. The driver's door of the police cruiser opened. A tall officer stepped out, adjusting his duty belt as he stared directly at Marcus, then at the Ferrari, then back at Marcus again. His expression hardened. Marcus felt a faint ripple of confusion pass through him. Had there been an accident nearby? Was the officer looking for someone? The officer began walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps, his boots echoing against the pavement. The tension in the parking lot grew thick enough that people nearby instinctively reached for their phones. By the time the officer stopped in front of Marcus, several cameras were already recording. The officer's eyes scanned Marcus from head to toe before settling again on the Ferrari behind him. Then he spoke. "Sir," the officer said sharply. Marcus straightened slightly. "Yes, officer." The officer's voice dropped into a tone that made the entire parking lot uneasy. "I'm going to need you to step away from that vehicle." Marcus blinked in surprise. And in that exact moment, without realizing it yet, his quiet evening had just turned into the beginning of a nightmare. The flashing lights from the patrol car continued to wash over the parking lot, reflecting off the Ferrari's glossy paint and turning the scene into a strange mix of red and blue shadows. Dr. Marcus Bennett stood beside his car, still trying to understand what was happening. He had dealt with stressful situations all day inside the hospital, patients fighting for their lives, families crying in waiting rooms, nurses calling out emergency codes, but this felt different. Unexpected. The officer stopped a few feet in front of him. Up close, Marcus could see the man clearly now. Mid-40s, square jaw, a badge pinned tightly to his chest. His hand rested casually on his utility belt, near the radio. But it wasn't the uniform that caught Marcus's attention. It was the officer's eyes. They weren't curious. They were suspicious. The officer slowly walked around Marcus, his gaze moving back and forth between the doctor and the Ferrari, as if trying to piece together a puzzle. He circled the car once, then twice. His boots scraped lightly against the pavement as he leaned forward to inspect the vehicle more closely. His fingers ran across the Ferrari emblem on the hood, then across the smooth red paint. Marcus stayed calm. He had learned long ago that calmness was often the best response in tense situations. Panic never helped anyone, not in surgery, and certainly not here. Finally, the officer stopped directly in front of him again. "You own this car?" the officer asked. His voice carried a tone that wasn't really a question. Marcus nodded politely. "Yes, sir." "I do." The officer raised an eyebrow. "You do?" It wasn't disbelief, exactly. It was something colder. Marcus noticed several hospital staff members now watching from the entrance. Two nurses whispered to each other while a group of interns stood frozen nearby. One of them had already raised a phone, quietly recording. The officer glanced at Marcus again, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you do for a living?" he asked. Marcus answered calmly. "I'm a surgeon. I work here." He gestured toward the hospital behind them. The officer looked over his shoulder at the building. Then he looked back at Marcus. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "A surgeon," he repeated slowly. Marcus could feel the skepticism hanging in the air. "Yes." The officer took a step closer now, invading Marcus's personal space slightly. "Funny," the officer said. Marcus waited. "Because usually when I see Ferraris around here," the officer continued, "they're being driven by someone a lot older than you." Marcus remained calm, though the comment made his chest tighten slightly. "I've been practicing for a while," he replied simply. But the officer didn't seem satisfied. Instead, he turned his attention back to the Ferrari again. His eyes moved across the car like a detective scanning a crime scene. Then he spoke again. "Step away from the vehicle." Marcus blinked once. "I'm sorry." "You heard me," the officer said firmly. "Step away from the vehicle." Marcus slowly took 2 steps back from the Ferrari. Around them, the quiet tension in the parking lot continued to grow. More people were watching now. Someone near the emergency entrance whispered something under their breath. The officer pulled out a small flashlight and shined it briefly through the Ferrari's window. Then he crouched slightly to inspect the license plate. Marcus could feel the situation slipping into something strange. "Officer," he said carefully, keeping his voice respectful, "is there a problem?" The officer stood up again. He looked at Marcus, then at the Ferrari, then back at Marcus. And for the first time, his voice carried open accusation. "Yeah," he said, "there might be." Marcus felt a quiet wave of disbelief wash over him. "I just finished my shift inside the hospital," he explained calmly. "If you'd like, I can show you my ID." But the officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at Marcus for several seconds. Then he said the words that made the crowd around them shift uncomfortably. "How about you explain to me," the officer said slowly, "how someone like you ended up driving a car like this?" For a moment, the entire parking lot seemed to fall silent. The officer's question hung in the air like a spark, waiting to ignite something bigger. Marcus Bennett felt the weight of dozens of eyes suddenly fixed on him. Nurses, interns, a couple of paramedics near the ambulance bay, everyone had paused to watch what was happening. He could even see a few phones raised now, quietly recording. Marcus took a slow breath. He had faced far worse pressure inside an operating room, but something about this moment felt different. There was an uncomfortable tension in the officer's voice. Something that suggested this situation had already been decided in his mind. Marcus kept his tone calm. "Officer, I'm not sure what you mean," he said. "I'm a trauma surgeon here at Street Gabriel. I've worked here for almost 10 years. The officer's lips curled slightly. "Uh-huh," he muttered. He took another step closer to Marcus, his posture stiff with authority. "Turn around." Marcus blinked. "I'm sorry." "You heard me," the officer said sharply. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." A ripple of shocked murmurs moved through the small crowd. One of the nurses near the entrance whispered, "Wait, what?" Marcus felt his stomach tighten slightly. "Officer," he said carefully, "I don't understand what's happening here." The officer's patience was clearly gone. "What's happening," the officer snapped, "is that I have reason to believe this vehicle may be stolen." The words landed like a slap. Marcus stared at him in disbelief. "Stolen?" he repeated. "That's right. But it's my car." Then you shouldn't have a problem explaining that downtown. Marcus shook his head slightly, trying to stay composed. My ID is in my wallet. If you'd like, I can... The officer suddenly grabbed Marcus's arm. The movement was fast and aggressive. Gasps burst from several people watching nearby. Hands behind your back, the officer barked. Marcus instinctively tensed, but didn't resist. Years of discipline and a lifetime of understanding how quickly situations could spiral told him staying calm was the smartest option. Still, the humiliation burned. I'm cooperating, Marcus said quietly. The officer twisted Marcus's arm behind his back. Cold metal clicked against his wrist. Click. The sound of the handcuffs locking echoed across the parking lot. A young intern near the hospital doors muttered under his breath. Oh my God, that's Dr. Bennett. Another nurse stepped forward nervously. Officer, wait, stay back, the officer shouted without even looking at her. Marcus stood there beside the Ferrari, now handcuffed in front of dozens of witnesses. The flashing police lights painted his face red and blue. Someone in the crowd whispered, "He literally saved my brother's life last year." Phones continued recording. Marcus felt the tight metal pressing against his wrists, but he refused to let the humiliation show on his face. Instead, he spoke calmly. "Officer, this is a mistake." The officer leaned closer. "Yeah?" he said sarcastically. Marcus nodded slightly. "You're making a very serious mistake." The officer scoffed. "Funny," he said, tightening his grip on Marcus's arm. "That's exactly what they all say." He pulled Marcus a step away from the Ferrari. The crowd shifted, uneasy. Even the paramedics had stopped moving now. Everyone could feel it. Something about this arrest felt wrong. Marcus glanced once toward the hospital entrance. He saw a familiar face among the nurses, a colleague who had assisted him in surgery just hours earlier. She looked horrified. Marcus turned back to the officer. His voice remained steady. "I just finished a 14-hour shift saving lives in that building," he said quietly. The officer didn't even blink. "Good for you," he replied coldly. Then he reached for his radio. "Dispatch," the officer said into the mic. "I've got a suspect in custody. Possible grand theft auto." The words echoed through the parking lot. Marcus closed his eyes for half a second, because in that moment, he realized something. This situation wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It had become something much bigger, and much more dangerous. The flashing police lights continued to spin across the hospital parking lot, casting restless shadows over the growing crowd. Dr. Marcus Bennett stood beside his Ferrari, his hands locked behind his back in cold steel cuffs. The metal bit slightly into his wrists, but his posture remained straight and calm. Inside, however, he could feel the weight of humiliation building, not because he feared the officer, but because dozens of people were watching. Patients, nurses, medical students, people who had trusted him with their lives. And now they were watching him being treated like a criminal. The officer tightened his grip on Marcus's arm and began guiding him toward the patrol car. "Let's go," the officer muttered. But before they reached the cruiser, a voice cut sharply through the air. "Officer, wait." The officer stopped. Marcus turned his head slightly. Pushing through the small crowd was Nurse Elena Carter, still wearing her blue scrubs from the trauma unit. Her badge swung wildly as she hurried forward, clearly out of breath. Her eyes widened the moment she saw Marcus in handcuffs. "Dr. Bennett?" she said, shocked. The officer immediately stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Mom, stay back." Elena pointed toward Marcus. "That's Dr. Marcus Bennett," she said firmly. "He works here. He's one of our trauma surgeons." Several people in the crowd nodded in agreement. One of the interns whispered loudly, "He literally just finished surgery an hour ago." But the officer's expression didn't change. "Ma'am," he said flatly, "this is an active police investigation. I need you to step away." Elena looked stunned. "But he's not a suspect," she insisted. "He saved a kid's life today. He's been in surgery all afternoon." The officer sighed impatiently. "Ma'am, unless you want to be charged with interfering with a police officer, I suggest you step back." The words caused a ripple of discomfort through the crowd. Elena's jaw tightened. She looked from the officer to Marcus, disbelief written all over her face. Marcus gave her a small, reassuring nod. "It's okay," he said calmly. But Elena clearly wasn't ready to walk away. She turned back to the officer. "Did you even check his ID?" she asked. The officer's eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, that is none of your concern." Marcus could see the frustration building in Elena's face. Around them, more people were gathering. 2 paramedics stood near the ambulance bay, watching with crossed arms. A few visitors had stepped out of the hospital doors to see what was happening, and nearly all of them had their phones out, recording. The officer glanced around and seemed to notice the cameras for the first time. His posture stiffened slightly. Instead of de-escalating the situation, however, his tone became even harsher. "Everyone needs to clear out," he announced loudly. No one moved. The tension was thick now. Eleanor stepped slightly closer again, ignoring the officer's warning. "Officer, please," she said, lowering her voice. "You're making a mistake." The officer let out a short laugh. "Oh, I'm making a mistake?" he said. Elena gestured toward the Ferrari. "That's his car." "Really?" "Yes." The officer turned slowly toward the vehicle again. For a moment, it looked like he might actually reconsider. But then his expression hardened. "No," he said. He pulled Marcus slightly forward again. "I've seen this trick before." Elena frowned. "What trick?" "Fake stories. Fake uniforms. Fake jobs," the officer said. Marcus's brow furrowed slightly. The officer pointed toward the Ferrari. "Nobody pulls up to a hospital in a car like that unless they're trying to show off." The comment caused several people in the crowd to exchange uncomfortable looks. Elena shook her head. "You're serious right now?" she asked. The officer ignored her completely. Instead, he reached for the door of the patrol car and opened it. "Suspect will be transported for questioning," he said into his radio. Marcus felt the moment tighten like a knot, because now it was clear. The officer had already made up his mind, and nothing anyone said was going to change it. The atmosphere in the parking lot had shifted completely. What had started as a routine police stop now felt like something much heavier. The flashing lights from the cruiser reflected off the hospital windows, turning the entire scene into a stage where everyone had suddenly become an unwilling audience. Dr. Marcus Bennett stood beside the patrol car, still in handcuffs, his wrists pressed uncomfortably against the cold metal behind his back. The officer closed the patrol car door with a sharp slam, but instead of placing Marcus inside, he turned back toward the Ferrari. The officer's pride had clearly taken control now. He walked slowly toward the car again, studying it like a detective examining evidence. The crowd watched silently. Marcus could feel the eyes on him, but he kept his breathing steady. Losing control would only make things worse. The officer ran his hand across the Ferrari's hood again. Then he crouched slightly to examine the front wheel. "Nice car," he muttered sarcastically. He stood back up and turned toward Marcus. "You know how many stolen vehicles I recover every month?" the officer asked loudly, almost as if addressing the crowd. Marcus didn't respond. The officer didn't seem to care. "People think they can just flash some fancy story and walk away," he continued. Elena, the nurse, crossed her arms. "That's not what's happening here," she said firmly. The officer ignored her. Instead, he reached for the Ferrari's door handle. "Locked." He glanced back at Marcus. "Keys," the officer demanded. Marcus nodded slightly toward his pocket. "They're in my right pocket." The officer stepped forward and reached into Marcus's jacket pocket without hesitation, pulling out the keys. He held them up in the air briefly. "Let's see what we've got here." Marcus spoke calmly. "Officer, if you check the registration in the glove compartment, you'll see the car is legally registered to me." The officer smirked. "Oh, I'm going to check everything." He unlocked the Ferrari and opened the door. The sleek interior lights flickered on, revealing the clean leather seats and polished dashboard. For a brief moment, even the officer seemed impressed, but his expression hardened again quickly. He began searching the car aggressively, opening compartments, checking under the seats, lifting the floor mats. The crowd watched every move. One of the interns whispered quietly to another, "Is that even legal?" The officer's radio crackled faintly on his shoulder, but he ignored it. Marcus spoke again. "Officer, I've already offered to show you my identification." No response. The officer slammed the glove compartment open. Papers slid forward. Marcus knew exactly what was inside. Registration, insurance, proof of ownership. But instead of calmly reviewing the documents, the officer grabbed the stack and flipped through them quickly, clearly more interested in proving himself right than actually checking the facts. Finally, he held up the registration. His eyes scanned it. For a moment, Marcus thought the situation might finally calm down, but the officer's jaw tightened instead. He folded the paper slowly. Then he turned toward the crowd. "This doesn't prove anything," he said loudly. The statement sent a wave of disbelief through the people watching. Elena stepped forward again. "Are you serious?" she asked. The officer pointed at Marcus. "This guy refuses to properly identify himself," the officer said. "That's suspicious behavior." Marcus felt frustration flicker inside him for the first time. "My ID is in my wallet," he said. "I already told you that." The officer stared at him for several seconds. Then his voice became cold. "Yeah," he said. "And now you're going to explain it to a judge." The crowd gasped. Marcus felt the officer grab his arm again. The officer spoke into his radio. "Dispatch," he said. "I'm transporting the suspect for questioning." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, because now it was clear. The officer wasn't looking for the truth anymore. He was looking for a victory, and he had already decided who the villain in his story was supposed to be. The back door of the police cruiser opened with a heavy metallic sound. Officer Reynolds pushed Dr. Marcus Bennett forward slightly. "Get in," he ordered. Marcus carefully lowered himself into the back seat, the handcuffs forcing his shoulders into an uncomfortable position. The smell of leather and plastic filled the small space as the door slammed shut behind him. Outside, the flashing lights still painted the parking lot in harsh red and blue. The crowd hadn't moved. In fact, more people had gathered now. Some were whispering, some were shaking their heads, and nearly all of them were still recording. Inside the car, Marcus took a slow breath. He had seen chaos before, car crashes, emergency rooms, trauma wards, but something about this moment felt strangely quiet. Not calm, just quiet. Officer Reynolds stood outside the cruiser for a moment, talking into his radio. "Dispatch, I've got the suspect secured," he said. Marcus listened carefully. The officer sounded confident, certain, almost proud. Marcus leaned his head back slightly against the seat and stared through the windshield toward the hospital building. He could see Elena standing near the entrance, still watching with concern. He gave her a small nod. She nodded back. The officer finally opened the driver's door and slid into the front seat. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Marcus cleared his throat. "Officer," he said calmly. Reynolds looked back through the rearview mirror. "What?" Marcus kept his voice steady. "I'd like to make a phone call." The officer snorted quietly. "You serious?" Marcus nodded. "Yes." Reynolds leaned back in his seat. "You know what usually happens when someone asks for a phone call," he said. Marcus waited. "It means they're about to call a lawyer," the officer said. Marcus didn't respond. The officer turned slightly in his seat. "You planning on calling one of those fancy attorneys?" Reynolds asked mockingly. Marcus shook his head. "No." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Then who?" Marcus spoke calmly. "Someone who can clear this up quickly." The officer chuckled. "Oh, this I've got to hear." Marcus gestured slightly with his cuffed hands. "My phone is in my jacket pocket." Reynolds sighed loudly. "You're lucky I'm feeling generous today." He stepped out of the cruiser again and opened the back door. Reaching into Marcus's pocket, he pulled out the phone. The screen lit up. Several missed messages from the hospital appeared. Reynolds handed the phone to Marcus. "Make it quick." Marcus carefully dialed a number. The line rang once, twice. Then someone answered. Marcus's tone immediately became calm and professional. "Hello." There was a short pause. "Yes. This is Dr. Marcus Bennett." Reynolds leaned casually against the car, listening. Marcus continued speaking. "I apologize for the late call." Another pause. "Yes. I'm currently at Street Gabriel Medical Center parking lot." Reynolds rolled his eyes. Marcus's voice remained steady. "I've been detained by a police officer who believes my vehicle may be stolen." The officer scoffed loudly. Marcus continued. "Yes, I believe this situation will need to be addressed quickly." Another pause. Then Marcus spoke one final sentence. "Yes, sir." Reynolds froze slightly. Marcus continued calmly. "I'll remain here until you arrive." The call ended. Marcus handed the phone back. Reynolds laughed. "Well, that sounded dramatic." Marcus said nothing. The officer opened the driver's door again and climbed back into the seat. "Let me guess," Reynolds said sarcastically. "You called your boss." Marcus looked out the windshield calmly. "No." The officer started the engine. "So who'd you call?" Marcus answered quietly. "Someone who's going to want to know exactly what just happened here." Reynolds shook his head with a grin. "Yeah?" Marcus nodded slightly. "Yes." The officer chuckled. "Well, whoever it is," Reynolds said confidently, putting the cruiser into gear. "They're about 5 minutes too late." Marcus leaned back against the seat. His voice remained calm. "We'll see." Officer Reynolds pulled the patrol car forward slightly, the engine humming low as the red and blue lights continued flashing across the hospital parking lot. Inside the cruiser, Dr. Marcus Bennett sat quietly in the back seat, his cuffed hands resting calmly in his lap. From the outside, he looked completely composed, but Reynolds couldn't stop thinking about that phone call. The way Marcus had spoken. Calm, confident, almost certain. The officer shook the thought away. "Guy probably called some hospital administrator," Reynolds muttered to himself. Outside the cruiser, the small crowd was still standing near the hospital entrance. Some people had begun whispering again. Others were scrolling through the videos they had just recorded. Reynolds placed the car into park and turned around slightly. "Enjoying the ride back there?" he asked sarcastically. Marcus met his eyes calmly through the rearview mirror. "I'm fine," he replied. Reynolds smirked. "Good. Because the station isn't exactly a five-star hotel." Before Marcus could respond, another set of flashing lights appeared at the entrance of the parking lot. A second police cruiser rolled in. Reynolds frowned. "That was quick," he muttered. The cruiser pulled up beside them and stopped. Two officers stepped out. But instead of walking confidently toward the scene like usual backup, they looked uncertain. One of them glanced toward the Ferrari, then toward the crowd, then toward Reynolds' cruiser. They approached slowly. Reynolds stepped out of the car to greet them. "What took you so long?" he said with a sarcastic grin. The taller officer didn't smile. "Dispatch said you requested assistance." "Yeah," Reynolds said. "Got a possible stolen vehicle situation." The second officer glanced toward the Ferrari again. "That the car?" "Yep." The officers exchanged a quick look. Then one of them lowered his voice slightly. "You run the plate yet?" Reynolds scoffed. "I checked the registration." "And?" Reynolds shrugged. "Guy claims he owns it." The officers exchanged another look. This time it was longer, more serious. Finally, the taller officer leaned slightly closer to Reynolds. "You might want to double-check that." Reynolds frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" The officer nodded toward the Ferrari again. "That plate came back clean." Reynolds' expression hardened. So? The officer continued carefully. "The name attached to that registration is Marcus Bennett." Reynolds crossed his arms. "Yeah, that's what the guy said." The officer hesitated. Then he said the words that made the situation shift. "Marcus Bennett, the trauma surgeon." Reynolds blinked. "What?" "Dr. Marcus Bennett," the officer repeated. "The one who testified last year in that federal healthcare fraud case." Reynolds stared at him. The officer continued. "You seriously don't know who that is?" Reynolds glanced toward the back seat of the cruiser. Marcus sat there quietly, watching, listening, calm as ever. Reynolds turned back toward the officers. "So what?" he said defensively. The second officer spoke this time. "You didn't hear about that case?" Reynolds shook his head. The officer lowered his voice even more. "Marcus Bennett helped expose a multi-million-dollar insurance fraud operation inside several private hospitals." Reynolds said nothing. He testified against some pretty powerful people. Reynolds felt something small and uncomfortable twist in his stomach. The officer continued. "And ever since then, the federal government's been keeping a close eye on him." Reynolds' confidence began to crack slightly. "What are you trying to say?" he asked. Before the officer could answer, a deep engine rumble echoed at the entrance of the parking lot. Everyone turned. Two black SUVs had just pulled in. The vehicles rolled forward slowly. Dark windows, government plates. The crowd grew completely silent. The SUVs stopped. The doors opened. Two men in dark suits stepped out. Their eyes scanned the scene quickly. Then they looked directly at the patrol car and began walking toward it. One of the officers beside Reynolds whispered quietly, "Those aren't hospital lawyers." Reynolds felt his heartbeat quicken slightly, because suddenly he had a very bad feeling about the phone call Marcus Bennett had just made. The two black SUVs rolled to a slow stop in the middle of the hospital parking lot, their engines humming quietly like restrained power. The sudden arrival drew every eye in the crowd. The flashing police lights from Officer Reynolds' cruiser reflected off the glossy black paint of the vehicles, creating a tense, almost cinematic scene. The SUV doors opened. Two men stepped out. Both wore dark suits, polished shoes, and small earpieces that glinted under the parking lot lights. Their posture was calm but purposeful, The kind of confidence that didn't need to be announced. They didn't look at the crowd. They didn't look at the Ferrari. They looked straight at the patrol car. And they started walking. Each step echoed softly across the pavement. Officer Reynolds felt the strange knot in his stomach tighten. He turned slightly toward the two officers standing beside him. "Who the hell are they?" he muttered. One of the officers shook his head slowly. "I don't know," but his tone suggested something else. Something closer to realization. The two suited men approached the cruiser. One of them pulled a small badge from inside his jacket and held it up briefly. The metal flashed under the lights. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," the man said calmly. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. The entire parking lot seemed to inhale at once. Reynolds blinked. "FBI?" he repeated. The second agent walked around the cruiser and looked through the back window. His eyes met Marcus Bennett's. Marcus gave a small nod. The agent immediately opened the back door of the patrol car. "Dr. Bennett," the agent said in a steady voice. "Are you all right?" Marcus shifted slightly in the seat. "I've been better," he replied calmly. The agent's eyes moved to the handcuffs. His expression darkened. Behind them, Officer Reynolds stepped forward quickly. "Hey, hold on," he said. "This man is under arrest." The first agent turned slowly toward him. His gaze was sharp. "On what charge?" Reynolds straightened his shoulders. "Possible grand theft auto." The crowd murmured loudly. The agent looked toward the Ferrari, then back toward Reynolds. "Is that the vehicle in question?" "Yes." The agent pulled a small tablet from his jacket and tapped the screen. He glanced at it briefly. Then he looked back up. "That vehicle is registered to Dr. Marcus Bennett," the agent said calmly. Reynolds crossed his arms. "That doesn't mean anything." The second agent stepped away from the cruiser, his tone now colder. "Actually," he said, "it means quite a lot." The two officers who had arrived earlier stood silently nearby. Neither one spoke. Reynolds felt the attention of the entire parking lot now pressing down on him. "I had probable cause," he insisted. The first agent stepped closer. "You detained a federally protected witness," he said quietly. Reynolds froze. "A what?" The agent's voice remained calm. "Dr. Bennett is currently cooperating with a federal investigation involving medical fraud and corruption." The words hit like thunder. The crowd reacted immediately. Several people gasped. Elena's hand flew to her mouth. Reynolds felt the ground shift beneath him. "I didn't know that," he said quickly. The agent's eyes hardened. "That's why you verify before making an arrest." The second agent reached toward the cruiser. "Let him out." Reynolds hesitated. For a split second, his pride fought back. Then reality hit him. Slowly, he reached for the keys. The handcuffs clicked open. Marcus stepped out of the cruiser calmly. He rubbed his wrists slightly, but said nothing. The first agent turned to him. "Doctor, we're very sorry about this." Marcus nodded politely. "It wasn't your fault." Behind them, Reynolds stood frozen, because in that moment, he realized the situation had completely flipped, and the man he had treated like a criminal was actually someone the federal government had come to protect. For a few seconds, the hospital parking lot felt completely frozen. No one spoke. No one moved. The flashing lights from the police cruiser continued to spin slowly, painting the scene in red and blue as Officer Reynolds stood there, staring at Dr. Marcus Bennett. But everything had changed. Just minutes earlier, Reynolds had been the one in control. The badge on his chest had given him authority, confidence, and the belief that everyone around him would simply obey. Now that confidence was gone, replaced by something colder, something heavier. The two FBI agents stood beside Marcus, their presence calm but unmistakably powerful. Agent Carter, the taller of the two, turned his attention back to Reynolds. "Officer," he said evenly, "I'm going to ask you something very simple." Reynolds swallowed slightly. "Did Dr. Bennett resist you in any way?" The question hung in the air. Reynolds opened his mouth, closed it. Then he shook his head slightly. "No." Agent Carter nodded once. "Did he threaten you?" "No." "Did he attempt to flee?" Reynolds hesitated. "No." The crowd around them murmured again. Several people lifted their phones higher, capturing every second. Agent Carter's voice became colder. "Then explain why he was placed in handcuffs." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "I told you," he said defensively. "I suspected the vehicle was stolen." Agent Carter gestured toward the Ferrari, and yet the registration clearly shows his name. Reynolds' jaw tightened. I was verifying. The second agent, Agent Mills, stepped forward slightly. By arresting him in front of half the hospital? The crowd let out a small ripple of uneasy laughter. Reynolds' face flushed red. That's not what happened. Oh? Agent Mills said calmly. He turned slightly toward the people watching. Anyone here record the incident? Immediately, several hands raised. At least a dozen phones were already pointed toward them. One of the interns stepped forward nervously. I recorded everything, he said. Agent Mills nodded. Would you mind sending that footage to us? The intern nodded quickly. Of course. Reynolds' stomach dropped. Agent Carter folded his arms. That footage will be very helpful. Reynolds suddenly felt the weight of every eye on him. The crowd was no longer uncertain. Now they were watching him the way people watch a story unfold, a story where the roles had suddenly reversed. Helena stepped closer again. Officer, she said firmly, we told you who he was. Reynolds didn't respond. Agent Carter turned back to him. You detained a cooperating federal witness without verifying his identity. Reynolds tried to recover. I had reason to believe. Agent Mills cut him off. You had an assumption. The words landed hard. Reynolds felt his authority slipping away piece by piece. The two officers who had arrived earlier stood silently nearby. Neither one was stepping in to defend him, because they knew. This situation had gone too far. Agent Carter pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Yes, he said quietly. We're at Street Gabriel Medical Center. A pauser. Yes. The situation is confirmed. Another pause. Then he nodded. Understood. He hung up. Reynolds watched him carefully. Who was that? He asked. Agent Carter looked him directly in the eyes. That was your department. Reynolds blinked. My department? They're sending a supervisor, the agent said calmly. Reynolds' heart sank. The realization finally hit him. This wasn't just an awkward mistake anymore. It was an official incident. An incident recorded by dozens of witnesses. An incident involving a federally protected witness. An incident that was about to be reviewed by his own department. Agent Mills looked toward Marcus. Doctor, he said respectfully, we'll make sure this is handled properly. Marcus nodded calmly. I appreciate that. Behind them, Reynolds stood in silence. For the first time since stepping out of his patrol car earlier that evening, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Fear. Because deep down, he was beginning to understand something. The arrest, he thought, would make him look like a hero, was about to become the moment that destroyed his career. 6 weeks later, the quiet tension of that evening in the hospital parking lot had transformed into something much bigger. What started as a misunderstanding between a police officer and a surgeon had now become a story followed across the entire city. The video recordings taken by witnesses had spread quickly online. Within hours of the incident, clips of the arrest had appeared on social media. By the next morning, local news stations were replaying the footage. And now, the case had reached its most serious stage. The courtroom. Inside Courtroom 3B of the city courthouse, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Rows of wooden benches were filled with reporters, legal observers, hospital staff, and curious members of the public who had followed the story since the video first appeared online. At the front of the room sat Dr. Marcus Bennett. Unlike the night of the incident, he wasn't wearing his hospital jacket. Today he wore a dark gray suit, his posture straight and composed as always. Beside him sat his attorney, quietly organizing several folders, filled with documents and printed screenshots. Across the room sat Officer Daniel Reynolds. The man who once stood confidently beside a police cruiser now looked very different. His uniform was gone. Instead, he wore a plain suit that seemed slightly too large for his shoulders. His eyes remained fixed on the table in front of him, avoiding the dozens of cameras positioned in the back of the courtroom. The courtroom doors opened. All rise. Everyone stood as Judge Eleanor Matthews entered the room. She was known across the city as a no-nonsense judge who had little patience for abuse of authority. She took her seat. Please be seated. The quiet scraping of chairs filled the room as everyone sat again. Judge Matthews adjusted her glasses and opened the case file in front of her. Today we are reviewing the incident involving Officer Daniel Reynolds and Dr. Marcus Bennett, she said calmly. Her voice carried clearly across the room. The judge looked toward the prosecutor. Are we ready to proceed? Yes, Your Honor. The prosecutor stood and approached the center of the courtroom. He turned toward the judge. Your Honor, before we begin testimony, The prosecution would like to present video evidence obtained from witnesses at the scene. A large monitor beside the judge flickered to life. The room grew completely silent. The video began to play. The footage showed the hospital parking lot that evening. The red Ferrari. The flashing police lights. Then Officer Reynolds approaching Marcus. The recording continued. The moment Marcus calmly explained he was a surgeon. The moment the nurse tried to intervene. The moment Reynolds grabbed Marcus's arm. And finally, the sound of the handcuffs locking. The video ended. No one in the courtroom spoke. Judge Matthews looked toward Officer Reynolds. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were sharp. "Officer Reynolds," she said slowly, "did Dr. Bennett threaten you in any way during this interaction?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "No, Your Honor." "Did he attempt to flee?" "No." "Did he refuse to provide identification?" Reynolds hesitated. "Well, technically." "Answer the question," the judge said firmly. Reynolds lowered his voice. "No." The judge nodded once. Then she turned toward Dr. Bennett. "Doctor," she said, "during the entire incident, did you raise your voice or resist the officer?" Marcus shook his head calmly. "No, Your Honor." Judge Matthews leaned back slightly in her chair. She closed the case file. The room felt heavier now, because the truth had been laid out clearly for everyone to see. The judge looked toward Officer Reynolds one more time. Her voice was steady. "Officer Reynolds," she said, "the footage shows a man who remained calm and cooperative while being publicly detained without sufficient cause." She paused, and that raises very serious concerns about the conduct of this arrest. Across the courtroom, Reynolds sat completely still, because in that moment, he knew the story that began in the hospital parking lot was about to reach its most devastating conclusion. The courtroom had never felt so heavy. After the video finished playing, a quiet tension settled over the room like a thick fog. Reporters leaned forward with their pens ready. Cameras remained fixed on the front of the courtroom. Even the quiet hum of the air conditioning seemed louder than usual. At the center of it all sat Officer Daniel Reynolds. The confident posture he once carried was gone. His shoulders were slightly hunched, and his eyes stayed locked on the wooden desk in front of him, as if avoiding every gaze in the room. Judge Eleanor Matthews removed her glasses slowly and folded her hands. She had spent several minutes reviewing the documents placed before her: police reports, witness statements, and the footage the court had just watched. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but unmistakably firm. "Officer Reynolds," she began, "this court recognizes that police officers often make difficult decisions in tense situations." Reynolds lifted his head slightly. For a brief moment, hope flickered across his face. But the judge continued. "However," she said, "this case does not appear to involve a tense or rapidly evolving threat." Her eyes shifted toward the large monitor where the footage had been displayed moments earlier. The video clearly shows a calm, cooperative citizen who repeatedly offered to identify himself. A ripple of murmurs moved through the gallery. Judge Matthews continued. "Dr. Marcus Bennett was detained in a public place, placed in handcuffs, and accused of a serious crime without sufficient evidence." Across the courtroom, Marcus sat quietly, his expression unchanged. The judge turned a page in the case file. "Additionally," she continued, "multiple witnesses, including hospital staff, attempted to clarify Dr. Bennett's identity during the incident." Reynolds' attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Judge Matthews looked directly at Reynolds now, yet those warnings were ignored. The words hung in the room. Reynolds swallowed. "Your Honor," his attorney began cautiously, "my client believed he was acting in the interest of public safety." Judge Matthews nodded slowly. "I understand that argument," she said, then her tone hardened slightly. "But public safety does not excuse reckless assumptions." The gallery grew even quieter. The judge leaned slightly forward. "The power granted to law enforcement officers comes with an enormous responsibility," she said. "When that responsibility is misused, even unintentionally, it damages the public's trust." Reynolds lowered his gaze again. Judge Matthews closed the case file. Her next words would determine everything. "Based on the evidence presented," she said, "this court finds that the detention of Dr. Bennett lacked proper justification." Several reporters began writing quickly. The judge continued. "The conduct displayed during the arrest constitutes unlawful detention and a violation of departmental protocol." Reynolds' face drained of color. Judge Matthews turned slightly toward the clerk. The court therefore recommends immediate disciplinary review by the department and authorizes the civil claims filed by Dr. Bennett to proceed. A low wave of whispers filled the courtroom. Marcus's attorney placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but Marcus himself remained quiet. The judge looked once more toward Reynolds. "Officer Reynolds," she said, "law enforcement authority must be exercised with caution, humility, and respect." She paused. Those principles were not followed on the evening in question. Reynolds said nothing. He simply sat there as the reality settled over him. The courtroom doors opened quietly as more reporters stepped inside, eager to capture the moment. Judge Matthews picked up the small wooden gavel. "This court stands adjourned." Bang! The sharp sound echoed through the courtroom, and with it, the story that began with flashing lights in a hospital parking lot had reached its most decisive turning point, because the man who once believed he was enforcing the law had just been publicly judged by it. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sky had turned a soft shade of gray. Reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers filled the wide stone steps that led down to the street. Word of the ruling had already spread. Microphones were raised, camera lenses adjusted. Everyone was waiting for the same person, Dr. Marcus Bennett. When the courthouse doors finally opened, the crowd immediately stirred. Marcus stepped outside slowly, followed by his attorney. Unlike the tension-filled night in the hospital parking lot weeks earlier, his posture was calm and steady. But the moment reporters spotted him, questions began flying from every direction. "Dr. Bennett, do you feel justice was served today? Doctor, do you plan to pursue further action? Do you think this incident reflects a larger problem with police authority?" The flashing cameras created a storm of light around him. Marcus paused at the top of the courthouse steps. For a brief moment, he looked out over the crowd. Then he raised his hand gently. The reporters quieted. Marcus wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed attention. Most of his life had been spent inside operating rooms, far away from cameras and microphones. But today was different. Today, the entire city had watched what happened to him, and they were waiting to hear what he would say. Marcus spoke calmly. "I didn't ask for this situation," he began. His voice was steady, but there was a quiet strength behind it. "I was simply leaving work after a long day at the hospital." Several reporters nodded. Marcus continued, "I respect law enforcement. Many officers do incredibly difficult jobs every day, and they do them with integrity." He paused briefly. "But authority is a powerful thing," he added, "and power should always be handled carefully." The crowd listened closely. Marcus looked down at the courthouse steps for a moment before continuing. "The truth is, anyone can make a mistake." The word surprised several reporters. "But what matters," Marcus said, looking back up, "is whether we learn from those mistakes." A few people in the crowd quietly applauded. Marcus smiled faintly. "I didn't stay calm that night because I thought things would be easy," he said. "I stayed calm because losing control would have made the situation worse." One of the reporters spoke up. "Doctor, what would you say to people who watched the video and felt angry about what happened to you?" Marcus thought about the question for a moment. Then he answered, "I would say something very simple." He glanced toward the courthouse doors behind him. "Treat people with respect." The reporters grew quiet again. Marcus continued, "You never know who someone is. You never know what they've done, what they've sacrificed, or what they're going through." His voice softened slightly. "That night, people saw a man in handcuffs." He paused, "but they didn't see the 14-hour shift that came before it, or the lives we had just saved in that hospital." The words carried through the crowd. Marcus took a slow breath. "Respect costs nothing," he said, "but it can prevent a lot of damage." Another wave of quiet applause moved through the crowd. Marcus gave a small nod to the reporters. "Thank you." Then he stepped down the courthouse stairs and walked toward the street. The crowd parted to let him pass. Some people nodded respectfully as he moved by. Others simply watched in silence, because the man who had once stood humiliated beside a police cruiser had just walked away with something far more powerful than revenge. He walked away with dignity, and as Marcus Bennett disappeared into the busy city street, one simple truth remained clear to everyone who had followed the story. Sometimes the strongest victory isn't proving someone wrong. Sometimes it's simply standing calmly and letting the truth speak for itself.